All right, we've heard a lot about the kinds of issues that are being faced by the marine mammals in the Pacific Northwest, and in particular the killer whales. It's now time to hear a little bit about what's happening to try to mitigate some of these issues. We'll have a series of 3 presentations. We'll hold questions for those presentations until the panel that will happen at the end of that session. Our objectives for this session are to understand the status of the southern resident killer whale population, its risk of further decline and extinction, and key uncertainties in assessing those risks. We also want to identify the relative importance of the most important stressors that are affecting the condition, health, status, and viability of these animals. Our first presentation will be on federal, state, local, and bilateral actions targeted at reducing the impact of reduced prey availability. It'll be a team talk with Dr. Elizabeth Babcock of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Coordinator and North Puget Sound Branch Chief of NMF's West Coast Regional Office. Dr. Babcock oversees regulatory programs, external partnerships, and salmon recovery planning. She co-chairs the Puget Sound Federal Task Force Regional Implementation Team, represents the agency on several boards, and is the regional policy lead for the Tribal Treaty Rights at Risk Initiative. She'll be joined by Dr. Penny Becker, the policy lead of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Dr. Becker has a diverse background working in Washington and in East and Southern Africa on conservation biology and targeted recovery of imperiled species. Dr. Babcock?
Thank you, and thanks to the Commission for the invitation to talk with you today. Before I get started, I wanted to just make an acknowledgement that I just got a heck of a promotion because I'm not actually a doctor. Penny is, but I just want to correct the record. I have a master's degree, but not a PhD. So we are going to make a shift into the afternoon discussion from the science discussions that we covered in the morning into some of the management activities that our agencies and the region are engaged in. We'll go through federal, state, and local sort of organizational structure, and then we'll also talk a little bit about a particular example here in Puget Sound related to Chinook salmon. So I wanted to start with laying out the framework that recovery of both salmon and killer whales, as you've heard this morning, occurs in a really complicated management structure. It's complex both from a management and agency perspective and also from a multi-layered government and governance structure. This pertains to all aspects of both salmon and killer whale recovery. If we look at the habitat side of the house, we have restoration activities that involve tribal, federal, state, and local authorities and agencies. On the hatchery side, again, we've got multiple levels of both interest and authority from tribes, federal agencies, state agencies, and a variety of management measures that are executed by each of those parties. Same thing is true on the harvest side. We've got tribal interest, regional agency interest at both the federal and state level, and international authorities. So I want to shift now and introduce one of the things we're going to spend a little bit of time on because we are in Puget Sound, and Puget Sound Chinook is one of the things that I've spent a good bit of time on in the last 15 years. We have a recovery plan, which I'll speak about in just a few minutes, that's essentially a blueprint for recovering ESA, Endangered Species Act listed salmon here on the domestic side, U.S. side of the Salish Sea. We know quite a bit about, as you heard this morning, we know quite a bit about these salmon, both within what they do here in the United States and then where they go when they go out into the Salish Sea and the broader marine environment. This is becoming increasingly important, again, as you were hearing this morning, because as we figure out where the killer whales need the salmon, we are also looking at where are the salmon based on their run timing within not only this listed unit, which we call our evolutionarily significant unit for ESA purposes, but also within individual watersheds across that ESU. We also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the orienting principle for the recovery of listed Chinook and also for the recovery efforts that the Governor's Task Force and the Orca recovery teams are engaging in. We needed to get focused, as you heard just before the break. We need to really start thinking about what are the priorities, what are the top 3 to 5 actions that need to be taken immediately, what are the actions that need to be taken over a longer term. So to get at that, the task force has developed, in coordination with our agency and many others, a prey prioritization framework for southern resident killer whales. It's a draft conceptual model that's on the screen here. The idea is to observe where are the southern resident killer whales feeding and what are they feeding on, and then to look at what's consumed and what is the condition of the killer whales when they are feeding, and what is in their diet in those particular times and places. And then to look at that connection, what is the degree of spatial relationship and temporal overlap between when the killer whales need them and when the salmon are there. And then finally, what's the status of the Chinook, both from a population abundance and an availability standpoint. I want to just spend a couple of seconds on this to orient you about how NOAA Fisheries is looking at recovery across the West Coast. We have individual, what we call recovery domains, and within each of those, we have recovery efforts that are led by our agency, but are very heavily involved with local and federal agencies, and also with state and tribal co-managers and partners. Nested within this larger framework of the West Coast recovery approach is the red ESUs that you see there for Puget Sound that I'm now going to jump to. So I want to spend a few minutes on the Puget Sound Chinook recovery example, because it's the first time in the Northwest that NOAA Fisheries engaged in trying to build a recovery plan with all of the partners that can make the decisions that are necessary to ultimately lead to recovery. Our previous experience before this recovery plan for salmonids was the Snake River plan that we wrote ourselves, and it sat on a shelf because nobody had been engaged in drafting it and buying into the recovery measures that were contained therein. So the idea was flip that model on its head, get everybody who cares and has authority and funds to bring to the table involved. We did that and ultimately approved the plan in 2007. The things I wanted to make sure you're aware of are that there are 22 listed populations within this larger listed unit, the ESU, and each of those populations were determined by our technical recovery team to need to improve from their status at the time of the recovery plan adoption. In addition, we had a handful of essential populations that the TRT determined we couldn't get to recovery for the larger listed unit if those particular populations were not also recovered. And we also have significant monitoring and adaptive management elements in the plan. So this is a mind-boggling slide. The idea here is simply to get the concept that, as I said earlier in the presentation, that habitat and other management measures in Puget Sound and across the West are occurring within this very complex land use management and government infrastructure and sort of organizational paradigm. Here in Puget Sound, we've got a federal level task force that brings all of the federal natural resource agencies together to make decisions and to keep each other apprised of what we're doing. That's led by my agency and the Environmental Protection Agency. We also have strong collaborations with the Department of Fish and Wildlife at the state level, Department of Ecology. We also have multiple federally recognized tribes, counties, states, and so on. And we also have a number of environmental groups that are really heavily engaged in both, as you know, both the salmon recovery and the killer whale efforts. Layer on top of that an unheard of population pressure, particularly here in central Puget Sound. We are, City of Seattle, as most of you know, are the fastest growing city in the entire nation and have been for some time. So trying to look at land use changes necessary to promote salmon recovery, natal stream health, and so forth is really challenging. We do have a strong and pretty steady funding mechanism at the federal level that's been helpful in trying to advance some of that habitat work throughout the West Coast. So we have California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska are all funded through what we call the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. We've had some really significant investments, as you can see, since 2000. We've awarded over $1.35 billion in federal funds, and we've tried to really leverage those dollars at the state and local level through state, region, and regional recovery boards to stretch each dollar that is spent to try and get the most out of it for salmon habitat recovery. And I just want to underscore that the benefits for salmon recovery that are funded through things like the PCSRF funds also increase abundance and therefore help to promote killer whale recovery. So there's obviously a link, and I want to be sure that this slide is viewed in that context. A couple of these projects were mentioned this morning. We have had three really, really significant estuary restoration successes here in Puget Sound that I think are noteworthy. There are others ongoing in addition to the things that I just mentioned have been funded through PCSRF dollars. But the recovery plan for Puget Sound Chinook noted that the most important things to do to get bumps in productivity and abundance were to increase spawning success and to increase rearing success. And estuaries were highlighted as one of the most important places that we could make habitat improvements and increase productivity and abundance of the salmon. So the Elwha Dam removal is the biggest dam removal that's ever occurred in the world. I didn't know that. I thought it was just in the U.S., but it's actually in the world. Two big dams were removed, and it restored the upper dam. The removal of Glines Canyon Dam enabled passage for multiple species of salmon, including Chinook, up to 60 miles of completely pristine habitat. So that was a giant national success. Skokomish Estuary, which is shown here in the top left photograph, is over in sort of central west Puget Sound, and we've had, again, a very big success there with multiple tribal, federal, and state and local partners. We've restored 1,000 acres of estuary there since 2007, and then down in central Puget Sound, in sort of the lower part of Puget Sound, is the Nisqually Estuary Restoration Project, and that is shown in the top right corner. Again, that's been a huge success, and one of the things that's kind of confounded that investment and that restoration work is what we've been hearing about the poor survival in the Salish Sea as a result of marine survival problems and problems getting launched out of Puget Sound. So now I'm going to turn it over to Penny.
And so while Elizabeth's talked a lot about the habitat restoration piece of how we're trying to promote Chinook abundance to benefit killer whales, we all know that that piece is the long term. And so what we're doing through a lot of our actions at all levels is really trying to benefit Chinook and southern residents both at the immediate term, the intermediate term, and the long term. The habitat is certainly the long term, and where we have some other places that we can benefit killer whales and Chinook are in other management options, and one of those is in salmon management. So that complexity that Elizabeth talked about in how we manage habitat, that extends in just a different way to the harvest piece. And so based on which fishery you're talking about, there are co-managers with the tribes, as well as cooperation across states and across boundaries with Canada. And this is highlighted in this figure here that shows the complex different management entities that are used for our far-ranging salmon. The Pacific Salmon Treaty was established in 1985 because of these complexities and because of the transboundary nature. In the U.S., these entities include NIMS, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. As an example of the difficulties in managing and trying to account for all the different sources of mortality and harvest for, say, if you look at the red line there coming out of the Columbia, those fish should be seen in fisheries all the way up to Alaska, down into British Columbia, and also in Washington fisheries. So when we're looking at trying to use one lever or another through harvest to change how we benefit Chinook, it's very difficult for us to do that in just one of these realms. We have to consider all of them at the same time. As you've heard a lot about this morning, exploitation rates and harvest of salmon have decreased, just as some of those salmon stocks have decreased over time. And the harvest levels you can see there, the orange is for coho and the blue is for Chinook. And Chinook in particular remains at a fairly low level, and despite that we still are seeing some of those impacts that Mike talked about earlier this morning. The effects of fishing on southern resident killer whales is still a subject of ongoing consideration, and it's been looked at through that 2012 study that I think Eric talked about earlier today, as well as the workshop that happened in British Columbia in 2017, and through ongoing consultation that NOAA is working on with us, the state. One of the things that we need to consider through that is that we're really looking at an all-H approach to benefit both Chinook and orcas. And so this is one of the factors that have to be considered, but certainly not in isolation. And so in thinking about what we can do on a harvest level, we're constantly thinking about all those other H's as well as predation and which one of those issues we should focus on at any point in time. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the changes that we've made through harvest management on the state side in the next presentation. For hatcheries, we've heard about the significant contribution that hatcheries have made to the overall abundance of Chinook in our oceans and our waters. And this is something that we're cluing in on in lots of realms through the federal and the state agencies, as well as the task force that's been mentioned, and I'll talk about a little bit more later, as a really important way that we can benefit orcas in the intermediate term. And intermediate meaning 3 years or more, probably before we would see some benefits to killer whales because of the time it will take us to get some adult Chinook back that are the size that our southern residents tend to eat. But of course, we're looking at balancing those opportunities for increased production or adjusting production and thinking about the conservation of native Chinook stocks and other listed salmonids.
So as Penny said, we're taking an all-H approach to both of these recovery efforts. And back to the Chinook plan, it was very focused on trying to make specific recommendations for each of the H's. The harvest and hatchery H's tended to be covered more by reference to existing regulatory processes, and the habitat actions had more of the site-specific actions and strategies associated with them as they pertain to each of the different levels of government I mentioned before. I'm now going to give you just a quick overview of hydropower and some predation concerns that we have. One of the things I want to mention is what was covered earlier in the day. There is no silver bullet. For us to be successful, I'm just going to focus on the salmon side. For us to be successful with salmon recovery, we have got to make changes in habitat so that we get to long-term sustainable populations of salmon that are naturally abundant and able to produce in a natural environment. Also, we are going to need to manage our hatcheries in a way that are compatible with that kind of long-term perspective. But there is give and take. I know preaching to a knowledgeable audience here, but I think, as Penny said, when you consider things that might be done in the near term within that all-H network for southern resident killer whales, hatcheries really may be one of the very near-term solutions. For me, as the salmon person in the presentation, I'm thinking that does have to be nested or grounded in the longer-term recovery objectives. So we've got a lot of tension, no silver bullet, and I just wanted to remind people that that's not only true in the science realm, but it's maybe as true or more true on the management side of the house. So coastwide, we have a whole variety of hydropower management oversight activities ongoing. We've got the Federal Power Act. Here in Puget Sound, we have a number of Federal Energy Regulatory Commission licensed projects, including the Skagit project up in northern Puget Sound, which provides the power for us today, as a matter of fact, for I think it's the largest producer in the nation, I believe. It's a very, very big complex and the most productive salmon population area within the entire state of Washington or western part of Washington. So we've got a tension there. It's well regulated, I will give you that. We also have Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act provisions that apply to those facilities. We've made really significant progress across the West Coast on passage improvements, reservoir management, and flow controls. I've heard recently that there's concern that although that progress is being made and we're getting up to 99% passage at a lot of these facilities, are we getting the same quality of fish, the same quality of juvenile passage or health back and forth through those facilities as we would have if they were not there? So that's an area of ongoing research and interest and concern, and obviously it's relevant in the regulatory mechanisms that I mentioned. We've heard a lot about predation today, and in particular heard about some of the constraints that we face in trying to address this particular source of prey reduction in Puget Sound and across the entire range of the southern resident killer whales. We've got multiple predators here. We've got harbor seals, sea lions, seabirds, and predatory fish, and our strategies for responding to that predation for each of those different species, of course, has to be adapted to both their unique circumstances and to the species itself. I also want to note that there's a lot of rhetoric that's been generated around this that I think has been extrapolated from one species to another and to impacts on one salmon species to another. And I think it's important to make sure that we are accurately informed as we start talking about that moving forward. So our management actions aren't haphazard or inappropriate, but are tailored to the particular species and the predation concerns that we've got there. You heard we had limited management tools, as I said. I do think that the Salish Sea marine survival pinniped research that's ongoing and the assessment that was mentioned this morning is really important and is going to really help guide our management solutions as we deal with predators moving forward. And I'm going to stop there and close with the concern that I kind of opened with. What do we do in Puget Sound in particular? What do we do in any of these urbanized areas? On the left is City of Seattle, fastest growing city in the nation, and on the right is I believe it's the Snohomish Estuary, which has been an extremely abundant and productive place for Chinook salmon in Puget Sound. And yet, as you can see, encroaching population development is occurring there. So we have to figure out a way to through both our management actions and broader societal priorities and change, address both of these simultaneously.
And I think just to end, the fate of Chinook salmon in particular and killer whales are tied together. So as we're thinking about management of either one of those species, we're continuously thinking about one or the other. And I think the recent surge of interest around killer whales has sort of ignited some interest that you're going to hear about in the next talk and several others around killer whales, and that will certainly benefit us in the longer term for Chinook recovery and salmon recovery. But those things are not necessarily always linked because, as you heard before, sometimes it's just about the number of fish that we have for killer whales themselves. So we're dealing with those issues on a management front constantly, trying to benefit both species, but it's certainly a challenging topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Penny Becker will continue with the next presentation on state actions.
All right, and as I talked about a second ago, there is certainly a surge in interest both on the Canadian side and on the American side about southern residents and their current decline. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about today about something that our governor, Governor Inslee, has been promoting and put out in March to benefit southern resident recovery. I've been working on this for the last several months as a large portion of my job, trying to help facilitate the governor's efforts and for Department of Fish and Wildlife. The executive order that the governor signed was in March of, sorry, getting something funny on the screen.
No, I don't think you want to buy eggs.
No, I don't. Back this one. Perfect. Thank you. The executive order was signed in the middle of March, and it had two major components to it that were advised through that order. And another thing was in process at that same time, which was the supplemental funding that he and our legislators asked for southern residents. And so I'm going to dig into all three of those components a little bit. The supplemental funding, immediate actions to the state agencies, something that we could do within existing resources, as well as the establishment of a task force to focus on southern resident recovery. So the department and other state agencies are not new to Southern resident recovery, but largely it's been led over many years by our friends at NOAA with our support. One of the ways that the department has been most involved has been through vessel enforcement and support for outreach and education around Be Whale Wise guidelines and both the state and federal regulations around potential vessel impacts to Southern residents. And so you'll see the Be Whale Wise decal there, and that's something that our officers on the water spend a significant amount of time doing patrols for all sorts of vessels to make sure that they're maintaining those guidelines and doing outreach and education when we don't have Southern residents around even. And also partnering with other organizations like the Whale Museum and their Sound Watch program to collect both citizen science data on the whales and boater behavior, as well as helping with that education and outreach to them as well. The supplemental funding is actually helping us to fund 2 more officers that are going to be helping with those patrols, so we're pretty excited about that, especially in the Puget Sound area. In addition, you can see the list of things that were all actions that were included in the supplemental budget this year to help ramp up existing efforts to either benefit Chinook for killer whales or to benefit killer whales directly. I will highlight one, which is increased hatchery production and improving of facilities. We had both capital and operating funds that were given to the department to start looking at if we had broodstock available for places that we know that we didn't have conservation concerns, that we could immediately look at trying to benefit whales and start production. Because of that 3-year time lag before getting adult salmon out there, we've been working on that immediately this year. And then we're looking at, through the prioritization process that Elizabeth mentioned, finding where are the areas and the stocks that are most important to killer whales, and then being able to overlay that with where do we have hatchery infrastructure, whether it be our own, as was highlighted with the complex management structure that we talked about before, or whether it be tribal or other entity that might be able to help with increased production and ramp up our ability to secure more fish for the whales. We're also looking at supporting education and outreach in an increased manner and doing increased number of oil spill drills and coordination with our partners. And then we've got some funds for facilitating the task force that I'll talk about a little bit later. The first part of the executive order itself talked about 9 actions that the state agencies were directed to do immediately. And I'll highlight a few of these that I think are really meaningful. I mentioned before that we're working on prioritizing those areas that are most important to the whales, and that's a work in progress, and we're certainly making progress on that. Within the next couple of months, we'll be able to have some more definitive answers working with NOAA and other partners. Also, just as to give credit where credit's due, a lot of that was developed mostly by NOAA and the protected resources folks. One of the other things that was directed by the governor was for the Department of Transportation to look at methods to quiet ferries. So the ferry system participated in that slow down trial that happened this last summer, and they're looking at something similar for this year, as well as several other programs that will help to reduce their impact on the whales in particular. And lastly, wanted to highlight that in terms of harvest, this year we adjusted some of our seasons both to help to conserve some vulnerable Chinook stocks as well as to protect the whales, including some seasonal timing adjustments to harvest, as well as put out some guidance to all boaters, fishing and non-fishing, to try to maintain their distance off of the west side of San Juan Island, which we know is a very important foraging spot for the whales. So you'll see that map there in the red is the zone where we're asking people to maintain their distance. This zone isn't necessarily new. San Juan County has been promoting something similar with slightly different boundaries for a while, and we've been trying to put a little bit of extra outreach and education around that, and to highlight that especially to our fishermen, which are one of our major stakeholders. The Department of Ecology is working with that whale watch industry that, as you saw through a lot of the vessel impact talk, are often with the whales. So it's an easy fit to think about if they're already with the whales and we need to do some sort of operation like haze them away from a potential oil spill, we should create a curriculum and training to make sure that they're able to respond and help out in the case of emergency. So they've been working on that issue. And then we've been working with other state partners like state parks, the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office, and Department of Licensing to get more outreach and education out there. In addition, we've got a lot of existing funding sources, which Elizabeth talked about, some federal funding sources and I think some state ones as well. And the governor's request was essentially, we have a lot of entities working on these funding sources, overlay those with what's important to the killer whales and demonstrate to us how what we're prioritizing with what we use our funding for, our limited funding for, is going to benefit the killer whales. So prioritize that first. And in addition, one of the things that came up as a potential concern was about PCBs in those hatchery fish. So we saw that that might be a big proportion of killer whale diet depending on where they are. And so our staff essentially looked into what are the levels currently in our hatchery fish. It seems extremely low, and it's something that we've dealt with over time already. And looking at if there are any other potential sources of food for a hatchery fish that may in the future reduce that down to an almost zero level, and that obviously being the goal. And finally, the task force is the second and largest component of the governor's executive order. It started on May 1st, and it's co-chaired by Stephanie Soline, who's in the audience in the front up here, and Les Purse, who's from Olympia. It has broad representation. It's intended to be stakeholder-driven, so whether it be an entity that supports the recovery of orcas or salmon, or a stakeholder group that could be impacted by the actions that might be recommended by this group, we're trying to make those very inclusive. And there are essentially 4 bodies that make up this task force. Since it's a very large lift to do in such a short amount of time, we've got one larger group that's the task force and the decision-making body to determine what actions will go into recommendations to the governor and the legislature and others on what to do. And then we've got working groups that are focused on those 3 major threats of prey, toxics, and vessels, and really doing a deeper dive into those actions and coming up with what are all of the considerations that you need to think of if you're going to make a recommendation to benefit killer whales through mitigating one of those threats. WDFW and Puget Sound Partnership were named the lead agencies helping to staff the task force. And I mentioned the short turnaround because of our legislative session coming up soon and the governor having to list out some priorities for funding and policy. We need to come up with a report of what those actions could be by November 2018. And so we are at a full sprint between now and then to make that work. But the task force continues on through October 2019 with a second round and report of follow-up actions and other items that we're not going to have time to deal with in this first short stint. And those actions will be everything from policy and funding, how we should prioritize, suggestions of new partnerships that should be developed, and any other things. Essentially, he's asked for things that are bold, out of the box, nothing's off the table, and that we should think about it holistically. So we've gathered a good group of people together to think about this issue. And I think we'll do any questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Penny. Our next presentation is on ongoing and emerging federal, local, and bilateral management actions and policy initiatives, and it'll be with Lynn Berry.
All right, thanks, Randy, and thanks to the Commission for inviting us to talk about southern resident killer whales. It's been some great talks so far, and I have the luxury of going last, where I can try to tie everything together and draw from some of the things you've heard about or mentioned by some of the speakers and panelists that have already been up here to talk to you. So let's see. So the recovery plan has been in place, and even before we had a recovery plan, we've been working on southern resident killer whale recovery, starting in 2003 with some specific funding. We were fortunate to have support from Senator Maria Cantwell here in Washington. We completed the recovery plan in 2008, and our recovery plan really takes a broad approach to address all the threats. A lot of what you've heard about today is information we've learned since we did this recovery plan. And it also is an adaptive process. So the recovery plan is still a good one. It's not on the shelf. It's got an adaptive process that incorporates new information as we get research results, as we work with different stakeholder groups to move forward with prioritization of actions in the plan. And in 2014, we put out a report that focused on sort of what we learned and what we've been able to accomplish in that first 10 years or so of a really focused effort on southern resident killer whale recovery, research, and conservation. And then more recently, we've focused our energies even more, thinking about what are the most important actions over the next few years. So in 2016, NOAA put forward the Species in the Spotlight program, which identifies the most at risk of endangered status, at risk of extinction, marine mammals and other types of species across the country. And that allowed us to focus in on this Species in the Spotlight action plan. And there's 5 elements of that plan that mirror the threats you've heard about today and some of the actions that we've taken. Contaminants and health, protecting whales from vessel impacts, targeting recovery of critical prey, protecting important habitats, and really an education and outreach inspiration for stewardship. Even outside this plan, this doesn't cover everything. We're working on oil spill response. Transboundary coordination is an important element of our recovery program. And the Endangered Species Act, the consultation program, is another important part of our efforts. So I'll go through each of these areas and just talk about some of the actions we've taken, some of the next steps that we're working on, some of the partnerships that are really capitalizing on this new energy, this new attention to southern resident killer whale recovery. So we've been able to bring together some really great partners in the last few years to talk about health, bringing together veterinarians, pathologists, killer whale experts, many of whom are in the room and have participated in these discussions, and really trying to focus in on what's causing that decreased reproduction and what's causing the increased mortality. And we've put forth lists of priority actions, both on the research side to then inform management. And over the years, we've also had updates on things like body condition, and I've got some links to some of the reports and outcomes of these efforts if you want to really dive into the detail of what these expert groups have come together and put forward as important actions. And many of these actions that are identified are things we are actively working on. So some of the ongoing actions, Joe mentioned the health database with UC Davis, with Marine Mammal Foundation, and really with the entire research community to bring data sources together to really help us zero in on some of those variables that might be most important for reproduction or survival. The photogrammetry work being linked to biomarkers, you heard a little bit about that. Tracking and sampling animals of interest. When we are seeing something unusual that we want to learn from, can we focus on collecting those fecal samples or breath samples? And then also looking at body condition, blubber thickness, content, and really making the most of those limited opportunities for stranding investigations. What are the causes of death? Where are disease and pathogens playing a role? Or where are those human impacts that Dawn mentioned from stranding investigations to really guide our efforts? So this is a lot of partners. This ranges from NOAA Fisheries Science Center work. We've got University of Washington conservation canines helping sniff out poop on the water. All kinds of work being done focused on those health aspects. In the health and contaminants world, you just heard a little bit about the Puget Sound Partnership. This is a group led by the state that brings together state, federal, local, all these government jurisdictions, as well as stakeholder groups to think about how to restore the Puget Sound by the year 2020. This is an older version of the action agenda for the Puget Sound Partnership. but killer whales are on the cover. They're one of the indicator species, and this is really focused on some of those indicators for water quality. Chinook salmon are an indicator, orcas are as well. So this is a way to integrate the Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery Program into these efforts at all trophic levels and at all government levels for the health of Puget Sound. We've also worked on a report. This really came out of an Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultation on the Joint Base Lewis McChord wastewater treatment plant. One of the efforts we realized was that we needed to know more about PBDEs and what are the inputs, what are the pathways, and where are the data gaps in monitoring and also understanding the health implications for high trophic levels like southern resident killer whales. So we've got a joint report with EPA. We also worked with the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Ecology at Washington State. And this has a series of recommendations. So there are some plans on the table already where we can draw from what's already been analyzed, reviewed by scientists, and put forward as recommendations. And we can hit the ground running with things like the governor's task force. Protecting whales from harmful vessel impacts, we've really focused on enforcement, education, and evaluation. You heard about Be Whale Wise, and we have state and federal regulations in place. NOAA finalized the federal rules in 2011, and these include a prohibition on parking in the path of the whales and also an approach rule for 200 yards. We've done a lot of education and outreach with boating communities of different types on the rules and the guidelines. And we've also been collecting data through groups like Soundwatch. And we were committed when we put these regulations in place into evaluating the regulations. Were they being effective? Were we reducing the impacts on the whales themselves? And so we looked at the 5 years prior to the regulations and the 5 years following the regulations. We looked at a number of factors, including education and outreach, enforcement, vessel compliance, that biological impact for the whales, and then also we committed to reviewing the economic impacts. We'd made some assumptions that we were not going to have a significant impact on the whale watching industry when we put these regulations in place. So we recently put out a report, and there's some mixed results in there. I encourage you to look at our tech memo to see kind of what we found in all those different areas. But today I just wanted to highlight a couple of the recommendations. And some of these are newer, some of them are ongoing, and some of them are partnerships. So continuing and expanding the enforcement. You just heard about some additional officers and funding at the state level. That's really key, because one of the things this report told us was that there's a measurable increase in compliance when enforcement is on scene. It's not surprising. I think most of us probably slow down on the highway when we see a car from the police parked on the side of the road. So that's a really great way to improve boater compliance with the rules and the guidelines. Also continuing that monitoring from Soundwatch and their sister group up in Canada, Straightwatch, to really help us continue monitoring the benefits of the regulations and the impacts of vessels and what are those patterns, and increasing education and outreach. So also you've heard some of the DTAG discussions. This is a picture from one of the DTAG attachments of the suction cup, and really being able to drill down and understand the behavioral and acoustic effects of different vessel behaviors and different vessel, whether it's their speed, their distance, their different configurations on the water, to really help us pinpoint what's going to have the biggest benefit, particularly to foraging, and to making sure that the salmon that are in the environment are accessible and available to the whales. We want to continue to improve our estimates of that energetic cost of reduced foraging opportunities. What Rob talked about in his model is there more we can learn about foraging efficiency and that energy balance. And also, one of our recommendations was to encourage Canada to adopt similar protective regulations. Right now, it's challenging. We have a 200-yard rule in the U.S., and there's still a 100-yard or meter guideline in Canada. So having that equity will also help with education and provide some benefit to the whales. So it's great that we have our Canadian colleagues here today, and that we can work together to have transboundary efforts that are in harmony so that they have the biggest benefit. This is at the county level. We've got some folks from the county here today. looking at a whale warning boater safety flag to be flown when whales are in the environment around, and boaters can be aware and modify their behavior accordingly. They can follow the Be Whale Wise guidelines and regulations. And one of the new things that we heard a little bit about is turning off that navigational or fish finding sonar to reduce noise. This is a newly emerging issue, and we're going right out of the gates educating boaters on the water that if they can simply shut that down when the whales are nearby, it'll reduce the noise. We're still engaged in research to, let's see if I can get this going, to better understand the results of the DTAG, and I just wanted to show you this animation that shows the type of data that is collected. Deborah Giles has developed some of these methods to record all these components of the boats and matching that up with the tagged whale, which is the yellow dot in the middle. And so we can really get a sense of what are those boat movements, how are they affecting the whale's behavior. And this is really the simple 2D look at the surface, and with the DTAG data, we can really dive even deeper, and understand the recorded, the received levels of sound, how boats are affecting that, and then really look at the diving and the foraging behavior. So we're looking forward to some more results from that study, and now pairing with northern resident comparisons as well. We do have a whale protection zone petition in front of us. It was submitted in 2016. We've put that out for public comment, and right now we're reviewing the 1,000+ comments that we got. We're considering the recommendations and the outcomes of our vessel regulation review, and also coordinating with the state and San Juan County efforts. The outreach and the area that Penny mentioned, getting that outreach to the fishing community and to the boating community at large. This is the former sort of marine stewardship area that the San Juan County and the Marine Resources Committee has had in place, and the map Penny showed has an extended area to the point at the tip of the San Juan Island. So it's expanded this no-boat zone. It's a 1/4 mile along the west side of San Juan Island. The Pacific Whale Watch Association, this is the industry that's part of both U.S. and Canadian members. They've also agreed to stay out of this area, and they've also included additional guidelines for their industry, things like staying under 7 knots within 1 kilometer of the whales. And that mirrors, but is actually a larger distance than is recommended in the current guidelines. So that's a step forward. On prey, I think Elizabeth and Penny did a great job of really connecting the orca recovery and the Chinook recovery. You heard about some of the actions in the plan. The short-term strategy focus, and this is the report cover from a recent workshop we had up in Canada at the end of 2017. And you heard about some of the 2018 Puget Sound fisheries constraints to protect both salmon and the southern residents. And also the long-term strategies for recovering critical prey really focus on this prioritization of salmon stocks to feed into a lot of the salmon recovery and management actions that are already underway. And in a few weeks, we're going to have a workshop with colleagues at NIFWIF to really kind of explore that prioritization framework. Protecting important habitats. This is a map of the current critical habitat in inland waters for southern resident killer whales. Since this was put in place in 2006, we've had quite a bit of research, mostly done by our Northwest Fisheries Science Center, through satellite tagging, acoustic recorders, and sightings to help us understand how the whales are using their coastal habitat. So this is just an animation of one of the satellite tracks. Let's see if it's going to go. As you can see, started in Puget Sound all the way down to California and back up, and some movements. So we're trying to use this information to better understand what are those physical and biological features of the environment, how are the whales using this coastal habitat, and from multiple studies. And that will help inform our next steps on the petition we have asking us to expand critical habitat for southern residents to include those coastal waters. So we've gotten through the data collection and analysis, and we have pulled that biological information together, as much information as we have about what the whales are eating. You saw some slides from Mike Ford this morning about prey, That's been collected while the whales are in this coastal habitat in the winter months. And next, we have to do what's the 4B2 analysis, where we do weighing of costs and benefits for those different areas. So the benefits to the whales based on how they're using that habitat and those features, but also what are the costs economically as well as with national security. And then we'll develop a proposed rule for public comment. And just a really quick mention of one last part of our program, which is that education and outreach is a key part, and this is where some of our partnerships are the most diverse and widespread and really effective in communicating messages, not just about what threats there are to the whales, but what people can actually do in their everyday lives to contribute to habitat restoration or energy consumption, how they commute, all those different things people can do every day. A couple things, you've heard a little bit about oil spill response planning. We've had a couple drills to test some banging pipes that cause noise that can haze whales away from an area. And this is a picture of a number of boats lined up in a line, just trying to move forward, making a sound wall that would keep whales away from an oiled area. We also have some other methods that are kind of pre-approved and in our response plans and ready to go. And we just had a drill in May, this month, actually, just a couple weeks ago, with partners at the state and also with a local nonprofit group, the Island Oil Spill Association. And last but not least, I just want to highlight the coordination that's involved in all of this work. At the local and county level, the state level, it's a transboundary species, so working across the border on both research, recovery planning, stranding response, enforcement, those are all elements in our recovery plan. And with increased attention under the Oceans Protection Plan, we've had more and more engagement with Canada, not just Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but Department of Transportation and Environment Canada as well. And then also the industry efforts that you've heard about today, as far as the Pacific Whale Watch Association and the shipping industry. And that's it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Lynn and our other speakers for this session. It's an impressive portfolio of activities that are going on. I'd like to invite the members of the panel to come up. Okay. I was negligent and didn't give Lynn's bio before she came up. She's the Seattle branch leader of the NIMS West Coast Regional Office. She leads the NOAA recovery program for endangered southern resident killer whales, and she's worked on the ESA listing, designated critical habitat, finalized the recovery plan, and has implemented actions to conserve and recover the whales, including vessel regulations put in place in 2011. And your talk indeed showed that. Thank you. Several of our other panel members you've already met, and you'll get to hear more from them. But of the new folks that are up here, we have Dr. Deborah Giles, who is a scientific advisor and coordinator of Orca Salmon Alliance. She's been the field researcher of southern resident killer whales since 2005, and she's a science director for Wild Orca, a resident scientist and lecturer at the University of Washington's Friday Harbor Labs, and the killer whale scientific advisor for the Orca Salmon Alliance. In addition, we have Kendra Smith, the Environmental Resources Manager of San Juan County. She's an ecologist and serves as the resources manager. She spent 25 years working in watershed management and salmon recovery throughout Oregon before migrating north last year to expand her knowledge of Cascadia and the Salish Sea. An august group indeed. I've put the general questions for this session up in the background, but we're going to leave it up to the creativity of our panel and the members of the audience to deal with the issues as they see fit. What I'd like to do first is give each of the members of the panel who didn't have a presentation so far in this session a couple of minutes to provide some comments on what's been presented so far in the session. And we can start over at the left with Ken. You have anything you'd like to say at this point?
Well, I already made some noise in the first session here, but yeah, I've been studying the southern resident killer whale population since 1976, and had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Mike Bigg, who pioneered the photo ID of these whales. And I just learned the other day that Dale Rice, who hired me, didn't think it was possible. That was and of course, most people kind of jeered Mike at the time, but it's just amazing the detail that's there, and I hope it's helpful to the mitigation efforts underway.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Kendra?
Have to hold the button down? Okay, great, just figured that out. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate today. I really appreciate the broad understanding of the multiple threats that this species faces and the need to mitigate across all levels. From my perspective, you know, what we really have here is a people problem. It's going to take the collective willingness of us all to sacrifice for the benefit of another species. It's not really any different than what we've faced for generations in addressing salmon recovery throughout the Pacific Northwest. And for those of you who are not kind of steeped in salmon recovery, a great book I would encourage you all to read is Salmon Without Rivers by Jim Likotowicz. It really highlights the fact that we've had an unraveling of our systems for a long time. And piecing that back together from the beaver to the riparian areas to dealing with splash dams and the like, all of those recovery efforts didn't happen overnight and are going to take generations to repair. And we're doing what we can. But I do see, obviously, on the horizon as a climate migrant myself, that climate change is going to probably be the fundamental breaking point for us. As watershed scientists who've studied stream and river temperatures and the likely impact that's going to have on salmon streams and rivers, I think it's very important that we examine that very closely, because some of the places that we think we're going to support salmon recovery for southern residents may not be viable long term. So there's groups of folks that have been working on resiliency analysis of watersheds, and I think it behooves us all to take a look at that sort of work and really understand the interrelationships between those factors. So I think I'll stop there, and I imagine when we get talking further about some of the actions that we've been taking at all levels.
Sure, thank you. Dr. Giles?
I actually don't have anything to add right now. I'm excited for the questions. I don't have anything to add right now, but I'm excited for the questions.
Sheila?
I'll just echo Lynn's sentiments. Really pleased that we're seeing a lot of transboundary action, and we've been working on this for about 8 years together, Lynn and I, and so this is really the first time we've seen that major effort from both sides. And just 5 days ago, our minister did announce some closures to Chinook with reductions in 35% of the total allowable catch on Chinook. We're waiting on the details on how that's going to unfold, but there's certainly impetus on the Canadian and the American side to take action. It's just deciding on what that action would be is the most difficult aspect.
It is very encouraging. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up to questions from the commissioners and the scientific advisors and staff. Yes, Sue.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you all for being here. The presentations were very informative, really enjoyed them. And we heard a lot of science presentations earlier in the day, similarly informative. But I find myself wondering, how does science inform your work? Lynn, you said specifically that there is an adaptive process in the recovery plan. And if you're already taking action on echo sounders, that tells me that you can do some things very quickly. But I wonder if you or any of you could say a few words about how do you bring science to bear on the decisions that you're making?
Sure, I'll start there. Yeah, our recovery plan is really adaptive because it links the actions in the conservation and the management side with actions on the research side. And certainly we had more gaps a decade ago where we were able to identify for exactly what we're talking about today is that we need to know what fish the whales are focusing on, where they overlap with the whales at different times and places, and where we think the whales might be the most food limited throughout their range and throughout the year. So piecing together decades of work to finally come to a point where we can identify some priorities and share that information with the salmon recovery community, with the salmon management community to influence whether it's habitat or hatchery actions. It takes a long time, but we really have it set up in a way to feed the science directly into choosing the right next step on the management side. And that's been true for the vessel regulations. They were informed by all the science you heard Don present about distances and behavioral effects, masking, some of the work that Rob's done as well. All that fed into what was a good compromise, and that included economic research as well on the people side. So those are just two examples.
It's on.
So I would just add to that on the habitat side for salmon. I've got a couple of examples. So the science around priorities obviously led us to focus on estuary restoration. I gave you a few examples of where we've been successful there in Puget Sound proper. Similarly, the science has been leading us to understand the importance of shoreline areas for salmon recovery. And so it has driven my agency and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to work together to try to figure out how could we use the existing regulatory tools that we have in a different way, maybe tweak them so that they're more effective when implemented on the ground. We're in the process of doing that adaptation right now. My agency is doing a programmatic permit. That's sort of inside baseball, but we were changing the approach that we're using to shoreline regulation to try to be more effective and to incentivize use of the shoreline in a way that is compatible with salmon recovery, what we call soft shoreline. In addition, I was part of a study a few years ago to see what we could do at the federal level to change the way that we regulate and protect shorelines around the entire Puget Sound, what we call the supratidal zone. And we got so far in a consortium of agencies with a joint agreement, and that joint agreement wasn't at the time accepted by the agencies that had the authority to actually make those changes. It sat for about 18 months, and last week was on the cover of the newspaper for the Seattle Times. A lawsuit's been brought by an environmental group to try and force that change or compel that change. So I think that science can be used on the regulatory side both proactively, voluntarily by agencies that are informed by the science and realize they need to make changes, as my agency has, and WDFW is working with us closely on that. But I also think it helps to inform third parties who may want to take advantage of new science to help goose the system, so to speak.
Yes.
And I think from the vessel side, it's really important to mention ECHO, which is Enhancing Cetacean Habitat and Observation. And this is a stakeholder group that was formed by the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority in response to the increased vessel traffic that could potentially result from projects in the area. And they brought all the noisemakers, if you will, in the Sailor Sea together around the table. And it's actually a phenomenal group where you have everything from the cruise ship industry to the tug operators to the vessel operators for container ships, for tankers, right down through to I suppose who else is, and the ferries and the government, both governments on both sides of the border. And the stakeholder group discusses, we bring forward the science with respect to acoustic impacts, and we talk with them about what mitigation scenarios could work. And there's a lot of different ways to get to a reduction in noise, and the ones that the stakeholders buy into will obviously be the most successful. So it's been a really positive experience working with ECHO.
More questions? Robin.
Yeah, I have a couple questions actually related to salmon. And this morning, Mike Ford noted that it may not be the absolute abundance of salmon that's important to the whales, but the broad seasonal distribution of those salmon to allow them to maintain a healthy body condition throughout the year. And Mike also mentioned that hatcheries are heading towards conformity to when they're releasing salmon and salmon size that they're sort of targeting. And so I'm wondering, my first question is whether or not there's any effort within the hatchery community to think about trying to target certain runs that they would enhance seasonally in a way that would enhance periods of time when salmon abundance for southern residents is lower. And then another somewhat related question to that is that I don't think was discussed at all today, but certainly in the news recently we've heard about salmon farms and the potential transfer of disease from salmon farms to wild salmon, and I'm wondering whether or not there's any efforts both within Canada and in the U.S. to try to figure out ways of mitigating or eliminating that problem.
Who wants to take those on?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So your first question about hatcheries, I guess what I would say is yes, we're looking into those options. In particular, just yesterday we had a discussion on the prey working group of the task force with some of those as potential recommendations that we could be making. Once we have made a little bit more progress on identifying those priority stocks and where we might have seasonal deficiencies in filling in those gaps, then looking at what infrastructure we have available to us through the hatchery system, ensuring that we're not having undue impacts to wild stocks, and then going through that whole process to make sure that we're ramping up in the right places. So yes, it is on our radar. And I think to your question about net pens, it's certainly out of my bailiwick, but a lot of the discussion here in Washington has really been about non-native salmon, not about native salmon. So it's a little bit of a different issue, and our legislature actually recently took action to try to minimize that in our waters. I'll let you answer for Canada if you want to.
Anyone else?
I guess I can speak to salmon. In San Juan County, we have banned the net pens, so we don't want Atlantic salmon impacting our native fishery. We also do a fair amount of work with forage fish because that's what the salmonids are eating. So the San Juan Islands is a hot spot for forage fish production. So we're heavily focused on making sure that those species remain in place. And your question about timing is intriguing to me because with the work that I've done with folks down in the Rogue and the Umpqua in Southern Oregon, when I shared with them as I moved north, but I still go down and visit them, I said, do you know that your Chinook are feeding southern resident killer whale? And the look on their face was like, really? So it brought to light the fact that, here they are producing all of the Chinook in a system that they're trying to build resiliency for the long term, and the timing and nature of the hatcheries that they have there is something that we should be having dialogue with them. If the southern residents are moving up and down that coast, all of those communities on the Oregon coast and inland need to be engaged in the conversation as well. And right now, I don't believe they are at that level.
Other questions? Randy?
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said earlier about that is Kendra, about the climate change problem. And when you just said now building resilience in the Oregon natural production of salmon, can you give some examples of how that's done and what?
Sure. So in the case of the Rogue, we spent a fair amount of time gathering all of the scientific data and modeling that's been done around climate change for everything from bird distribution to temperatures to flow. Different modeling efforts have been generated. and we overlaid all of that GIS data that they built on which sub-watersheds were most resilient. And then we used that as a basis for figuring out which HUC 6 watersheds had the highest likelihood of resiliency, cold water refugia. And then, of course, down there, they do have a dam up in the headwaters, the Lost Lake Dam, that also provides cold water. So through those activities, even though they're, way down in southern Oregon and it's hot down there, they are looking at the strategies that they can impose, and they just received funding from Hewlett-Packard to do additional dam removal to open up those river and creek corridors to get to the cold water. So trying to support all the different salmonid species that utilize that system, and really kind of in a triage approach, because you're not going to be able to save everything. And I think that that needs to be done across Cascadia, because there's not a lot of time, and we need to figure and link these pieces together.
Other comments? Yes.
A few people today have mentioned the rising human population in Puget Sound and the greater area, the Pacific Northwest, as a potential threat to salmon recovery. And I guess I could make some guesses about how the mechanism by which that works. Elizabeth, you just mentioned something about shoreline development that might be relevant. But I'm wondering if you all might, some of you might want to comment on how does that manifest? I mean, the humans are not a priori and a threat to salmon. They don't live in the rivers. So how does that work, and what are the prospects for mitigating some of those impacts through managing development?
Talk about no silver bullet. I definitely have a different view in 2018 than I did in 2000 when I was starting the recovery planning work, and it's less optimistic, candidly. And I live in the Seattle area, so that's partly tarnished because of what I've seen happen around me. I do think there are ways that we can grow smarter, and I certainly think that there's a growing awareness in Puget Sound about how to do that, and it's informed by science. So our state ordinances for shoreline management ordinances and our state growth management act ordinances are operated at a state level but then implemented at the local level, and by law both are required to use the best available science. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful is if we, NOAA, could translate our technical memos and our scientific findings about what's most important for salmon recovery and things like shoreline protection, and put them into usable formats for those kinds of implementers, the local governments who are busy and don't have time to go research the science and figure out what that would look like in terms of a regulatory solution. If we could make it easier for them, I think that that's one way at the local level we can get better protection. I also think as properties are sold, acquisition of properties that should be moved out of the floodplain so that we can set back levees and those sorts of things. They're long-term solutions and they're incremental solutions. There's no really quick fix that I see happening there, but I would say improved regulation, acquisition of important and key properties are both important solutions. And I think education, as trite as that sounds, I think really helping the broader public and in particular our corporate partners to understand what compatible growth with salmon recovery and southern resident killer whale recovery could look like. And that would be a campaign that is bigger than something my agency's equipped to staff, but we can play a part in it.
Other comments? All right. Peter.
So I have kind of a vague question, but you have a listed population of southern resident killer whales, you have listed salmon, so in a way the protections, the legal protections are there. You have recovery plans in place for the killer whales and a lot of the salmon you have the governor's executive order. So I guess my question is just broad-based. You have this pretty holistic understanding. Are there any areas where you're not moving fast enough, where regulatory processes or other things are getting in the way of something you know you have to do?
Well, I think what's happening this summer is an example of how at different levels we can start with voluntary measures, we can build on the education and outreach to make them effective, and that can feed into a longer term, perhaps federal regulatory framework if needed. And so I think we're seeing that. We're seeing some impatience with some of the things that take longer and are slower, and people feeling empowered to take action, at all levels, whether it's an individual or your household or your community or your county or your state. So I think that opportunity's there. It's getting the information into the right people's hands about what those things they can do are, and just, making it, socially more the thing to do, peer pressure, that kind of stuff. So it's happening, but I think there's always more we can do on that level.
Yes, Daryl?
I would just
sorry.
add a little bit to that to support what Lynn said. I think what we're looking for are enduring solutions, and any sort of regulation, whether it be at the local level, the federal level, or the state level, are perceived in a different way than if it's done in an approach where everyone is sitting at the table and finding those solutions together, just as Elizabeth outlined with the recovery planning and the tactics that we're taking within the task force process. We're looking for solutions that are going to stay the test of time and that are going to be in effect and be successful. And so those take time. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, to really relay to people, is that even though we know that there's this major crisis going on, we're not doing nothing. We are doing a lot right now, but some of these other things that we're working on are going to just take us a little bit more time to get put into place.
Other comments?
At the local county level, we had a slide up earlier about the flag project that we're going to be implementing this summer. This was a project that Kendra and I had applied actually to your commission for funding for. And we were asked to go ahead and submit a full proposal, so thanks for that, we're excited. But even if we don't get funding from this body, we are going to move forward with it. And it's the idea of creating a new social norm around the whales, so how boaters should be behaving around the whales. And so we're utilizing this flag, this whale watch flag, and it's had some good success up north. In the northern Vancouver Island, they haven't had an opportunity to do sort of monitoring throughout the course of the project, but with the help of the Soundwatch Boater Education Program, we'll be using monitoring, so looking at how many boats are flying this flag, and then comparing essentially infractions against the Be Whale Wise guidelines with and without the flags. So the idea is to not shame exactly other, say, whale watch companies into, but encouraging better behavior. Anecdotally, up north, they say that when the flags are being flown by boats, those boats actually behave much better themselves. And so it's the idea of parroting or giving the right impression for how people should be boating. So we're excited that that's going to be happening. The flags have been ordered. We'll be giving them out. We have 500 flags. Francis Robertson, the new coordinator for the San Juan County Marine Resources Committee, is spearheading it at the county level. And it's a lot of work to begin with, but we're excited. And the idea is also to get more information at the state level into any sort of literature that gets sent out to boaters so that they get even more information about how best to behave. So we'll see how that goes this summer.
Great, thank you. Daryl, then Aaron?
So I'm pretty naive about the issue, and so I come to this sort of what I'm going to say from what I heard today. One of the things that struck me probably most in all of this is Ken's comments with his little piece of paper out of his pocket that said, here's the one potential reproductive individual left. And I think about what's happened to the vaquita, and I also heard an effective population size of 25 with what seems like incredibly low reproductive potential for the near future. I hear a lot of good science being done. I hear a lot of good ideas, most of which are probably years down the road towards resolving these problems. Is there anything that can be done immediately that might increase the reproductive potential or diminish the likelihood of the reproductive potential being drastically changed, such as the one thing that strikes me is noise disturbance is something that you can change quickly, but is voluntary actions, actions of perhaps increasing the distance you observe from whale watching boats and so forth. Will those have an immediate and significant impact on disturbance and sound? And most of the focus this morning seemed to be on sound, but I think Dawn made some comment about kayakers have an impact as well. So it probably is some combination of sound and disturbance. So is there something like closures or some more drastic impact that would be more immediate, but obviously with respect to stakeholders have a much greater impact on stakeholders? So that's kind of where I come from.
Okay, Sheila.
I can speak to what's going on the Canadian side of the border. We've identified 4 key areas in the Salish Sea in which to try and focus that all the efforts, including examining slowdown of the large vessels. We do have, the minister has requested the whale watching fleet undertake a 200-meter approach distance to southern resident killer whales, and they have agreed to comply, and they put that on their guidelines while we're working our regulations through the government process, so I can't give you a timeline on that. We've also, we're looking at lateral displacements as a possible mitigation, where we move the vessels closer to the center lane and away from those killer whale foraging areas. So we've just identified those key areas where the minister has made closures to try and reduce the fishing vessel traffic in those areas, and then where we can focus on those commercial efforts as well. So I think by looking at that more spatial temporal aspect and saying this is where the killer whales need those areas where the impacts are lessened, and they need food on the table there, not up north, not anywhere else, but where they are. And so that's where we're really trying to focus in on those areas.
And I would just add, I think one of the things that makes this a longer process than a lot of people would like is that the effectiveness of, for example, a geographic closure of an area is much more impactful if all vessels are applied to that. And so, very quickly, our agency could have done something that would have only applied to fishing vessels, but we don't have authority for the rest of the vessels, right, which would really not have a lot of impact and in fact probably create more strife and angst against stakeholders and potentially jeopardize our ability to be successful in the long run. So this is one of those things that I think we'll be talking about in the very near term.
And I'll just add that when we put our vessel regulations out for public review, we did include a west side of San Juan Island no boat zone back in 2009. the community was not supportive of that, fishing, whale watching, and was not at the table to really embrace it and give us an idea that it would be effective and followed, even as a federal regulatory. And it's challenging with enforcement considerations for something like that, all the different stakeholder groups. In our process for putting that out for public comment, we got 27 different variations of that different groups had suggested or that we had not fully analyzed or done an economic analysis for, for a federal rulemaking process. So it's something that's still under consideration. I think we're learning as these voluntary measures are going into place, whether it's a piloting a slowdown trial or a voluntary no boat zone. And I think that all, it does take time, and that we've done what we can that's immediate and fast, and in some cases, whether it's even effective or not, we're trying to take those steps. It's, this question number 2, what are the hurdles to implementing mitigation actions? It's really the people side of it, and what the community is willing to buy into and support, even if there is a mandate that comes down.
Okay, thank you. Aaron was, okay. Yeah. All right, Ken.
I don't have any answers, but I have a few suggestions. One, with my sort of philosophy background, I was just kind of wondering, is there, if the whales aren't here, it's kind of like the tree and the quad thing. Are we improving their survival by quieting a place where they don't anymore come? It just sort of, that the noise issue has always kind of bothered me, because when I began the study, there was a whole lot of noise. There was so much noise I couldn't do any recordings of the killer whales because it was fishing time. Well, anyway, the other suggestion, I was very impressed with what Kendra had here about the Rogue and the Umpqua River studies. I've been looking for, any watershed from northern BC to central California that has the potential of, immediate and long-term Chinook recovery. And that kind of information for every watershed would be very important to have, along with the sort of information we get from the Pacific Fisheries Management Council on escapement numbers and harvest numbers, et cetera. And incidentally, all these numbers in the early years, it would be 3 years before we get the information from the agencies. I think, in the computer age now, that we can be a little bit faster, but still last year's information from the Pacific Salmon Commission won't be available until August this year. And that kind of puts it at the end of this management decision time. So I would suggest that as much as possible, the data processing be speeded up in the agencies that provide and gather this data. And then I was always looking for the biggest bang for the buck in the river systems. Which ones would we prioritize to give the most fish to fishermen and to whales? And I think looking at every watershed in that whole range is possible, and they will travel to where the fish are. I don't think that it makes much sense to look at historic stuff of, oh yeah, they used to come on the west side of San Juan every day in the summer, and try and recover whatever fish would be populating that habitat for them to eat. That's going to be a very, very long wait. So build it someplace where it's economically and politically feasible. And that's why I've taken the easiest and most politically simple bypassing dams. And of course, that jumps right into the real big issue.
Thank you, Ken. We've come to the end of our time, but I do want to give Aaron a chance to ask his question.
Oh, thank you very much. I just wanted to have a follow-up question to Lynn. You mentioned that you were starting to recommend that boats turn off their echo sounders, depth finders, so on. Do you see a process where that can become a regulation and also be published in the Be Whale Wise site?
Definitely, you know, it's an adaptive process. For the first time, I saw Marla Holt show some of the recordings from the DTAG of the sounds the killer whales are making and this line, that's the 50 kilohertz fish founder, and just the number of DTAG deployments where that was recorded from the perspective of the whale. So it's new information. I think we're already going to advertise it this summer, and certainly, you know, on a voluntary basis immediately, but also we could consider that in the future for something regulatory. I think the challenges there are, especially with the when it's used for navigation and safety concerns, something we have to be aware of. But I think it's something whale watch operators are already doing for the most part, and we'll get as many boaters as we can to follow that as well.
Thank you, Lynn. Daryl, yes.
Vicki has a question online, so I think we should give her the opportunity to ask.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is from Vicki Cornish, Marine Mammal Commission staff, and she is asking, how important is strategic removal of dams to salmon and southern resident killer whale recovery? And if it is a significant factor, how receptive are the states to strategic dam removal?
Who wants that one?
It's a great question, and I think that the correlation between which populations are most important place and time in this to southern resident killer whale recovery in this context is part of the discussion. So one issue is generally what, as a policy matter, how do the agencies, how do the states feel about dam removal? That's one question. But the question about if one were to get a campaign to remove a particular dam, what would the benefit for salmon be and what would the benefit for killer whale prey abundance be? So I think you're asking a single question that's actually nested more in a number of both policy and technical realms. So the example that we used of, that I used of the Elwha is a good one to illustrate this, I think, because the Elwha Chinook are famous in this region. They weighed 110 pounds. There are stories that are just legendary about how incredible those fish were and how important they were as a part of a functioning ecosystem. To get the dams removed took a champion that just worked so hard with Congress for many, many, many years. I'm sure some of you in the room know how long that congressional team worked to try to create the political support and the funding necessary to do that. So it's important. I think regionally we've got some demonstrated success, but I think it's population specific, watershed specific, and I also think politically it's an incredible lift. So I want to turn it over to other people on the panel here to add to that, but I would just say, using the Elwha as an example, it is an important salmon river, and it's got an iconic species that had political attention and regional attention. Even so, it took many, many, many years to get Congress to authorize the removal and to fund it. I'll stop there.
Anyone else?
I would just add that I think that if salmon and killer whales were the only potential factor that we were looking at, then these answers would be much easier. But of course they're not, right? There's navigation and agriculture and economies and everything else that are tied to that issue. And so everything's being looked at in a holistic perspective. And dam removal is certainly not the only tool that we have in the box to look at how to mitigate some of the effects. And there are some things being done right now in terms of spill and some other things that are being looked at from a science perspective about can they work to benefit both killer whales and salmon.
Well, I'm on the spot here. I wish Jim Waddell were here, the engineer who worked for Army Corps of Engineers. He knows those systems in and out, and basically he disagrees with a lot of this. It doesn't, the existing EIS allows for the removal or bypass. The funding doesn't require to come from Congress. It comes from BPA. it's entirely feasible. And, you know, as we sit here and speak, there are half of the fish attempting to get up the Snake River system right now at the Ice Harbor Dam are bubbling out due to the spill. And it isn't spill that's being spilt not to produce energy, it's because there's no market for the energy. The economics situation should be, everything should be on the table, I think, in fact rather than myth. So that's what I propose.
Comments? All right. We're over time. I haven't had a chance to give the public a chance for questions, but it's up to you.
Well, we're actually in a session where we give public an opportunity to comment, so I'd say just open it up to public comment and questions, if anybody has any.
And if you do have questions, please come to the microphone and give your name and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm David Bain with Orchid Conservancy, and I actually have an answer to an earlier question, and that was regarding priorities. And the way I think of recovery is we've got a population that has the potential to grow at 2 or 3% a year, and we need to put together a package of actions that will allow that 2 to 3% a year growth. And it's also been pointed out that some of these actions have benefits right away. So, you know, Lynn could call up the TV stations tonight and say, turn off your echo sounders, and a lot of people would say, hey, that's fine, because, you know, we're not going to run aground in, you know, 600 feet of water. So, you know, when we're not fishing, you know, we don't need it, and whales would benefit from that, you know, tomorrow if they'd come in and be in the same place as the boats, which Ken has pointed out they may or may not do. You know, we've already got buy-in from commercial shipping industry on trying to be quieter. We've got buy-in from the commercial whale watch industry to try to be quieter. And, you know, they can kind of be role models for the general public, and we can probably get quiet, and that benefit will accrue to the whales right away. It's also been pointed out that fish recovery takes longer. So, you know, even if we decide that, you know, next season we're going to boost our hatchery production, you know, it's going to take 3 to 5 years for those fish to get big enough to be of interest to the whales. And if we're doing it through restoration, you know, we can go in and plant trees that create shade, that create cool water, that, you know, make new habitat available for rearing or spawning. You know, it may take, you know, 5 or 10 years for those trees to grow up, and then it may take another, you know, 10 or 15 years to get enough generations of salmon to, you know, take advantage of that increased habitat. And, you know, the same thing with dam removal. You know, even once the dams are down, the fish have to recolonize the area that the dam kept them out of, and then you need those couple generations. So, you know, you address noise right away to kind of try to bring an end to the crash, but you also need to be addressing fish right away, because you're not going to see the benefits, or the whales won't see the benefits of that right away. And then, you know, you start getting your recovery from, you know, fish improving. You know, the other thing that was mentioned is toxins, and, you know, some of the models I've seen say that, you know, toxins in a species like killer whales will peak about 40 years after you ban them. So if we address flame retardants right away, you know, it may be 40 years before the whales, you know, really see the benefits of that. But, you know, in our budget to get recovered killer whales, you know, we need to be thinking, you know, 50, 100 years down the road, because if we want a truly viable population instead of a minimally recovered population, it's, you know, at that 2 to 3% growth, even if we do it right, it's going to take that long to get up to numbers that, you know, we wouldn't call critically endangered if we used IUCN criteria. So, you know, there's some things we need to start on right away. You know, some things we'll expect to see immediate benefits, so, you know, the governor can take credit for it, and other things, you know, have to get done now, and it's going to be, you know, some future governor and some future president that'll take care of it, take credit for it, or future prime minister, and future premiers, and so on. And also like to echo Ken's point about the whales being mobile, and you know, creating fish anywhere seems to be beneficial to them. But I would point out that a lot of the calving takes place over the winter, and a lot of those calves aren't making it, and there seems to be a prey availability component to that. And that effect's been strongest in K&L pods, which are going up and down the west coast. So, for example, in the track you showed, you know, you saw whales going back and forth across the mouth of the Klamath River, and that's an area where their, you know, run that's synchronized with the whales has been as low as 100 fish, and you know, it seems typically to be about 1,000 these days. But historical estimates are that that run used to have 1 million fish. So, you know, we don't have to get back to 1 million, but even if we get back in the tens of thousands, you know, that would significantly benefit southern resident killer whales. So having a continuous distribution of food, so when they're doing that run up and down the coast, that, you know, they've got something to eat when they hit the Columbia, and something to eat when they hit the Klamath, and something to eat when they hit the Sacramento, and, you know, at least have a snack when they hit the Rogue, and so on. You know, that'll give those females the nutrition they need to lactate, because that takes 2 to 4 times as much energy as, you know, just everyday life would take. So, you know, I think, you know, some priority on, you know, that outer coast, and I guess another comment would be the time things are taking. Like, I think you said that, you know, critical habitat petition for the outer coast came in more than 4 years ago. And, you know, it would be nice if we could process, you know, conservation efforts like that faster than 4 years. And, you know, dealing with noise on the west side of San Juan Island, you closed public comment over a year ago, and again, it would be nice if you could process things that fast. And, you know, if you need more staff to be able to do that, you know, say so, and we need to find the money, or, you know, somehow that you can get the staff to process things quickly. So it's kind of, you know, we've, you know, I think Robin mentioned that, you know, back in '99 is when, you know, the red flags went up about what's happening to this population, that its recovery from the captures had come to an end, and that there was something else going on that was driving the population down. So that's almost 20 years with very little action. And, you know, we have plans sitting on shelves for what to do, and what we really need to be doing now is figuring out how to get those plans, you know, dusted off so that they're actually taking place. And where, you know, stakeholders are negatively impacted, we need to be thinking about ways to mitigate that impact on the stakeholders, so that, you know, we can start trying to get to win-win situations. And, you know, a lot of these things are going to require money, but, you know, we have the advantage of having charismatic megafauna involved. So, you know, if we had a whale recovery tax, that's something that may go over with voters a lot better than, you know, any other kind of tax. So, anyway, those are some thoughts.
Okay. Thanks for pulling those thoughts together, Dave. Other comments from the public? Or from our virtual folks out there? If not, then I'd like to thank Dennis. Oh, yes, Kim.
Hey,
Kim Parsons. I'm a contractor with NOAA Fisheries. I was just curious from the panelists. We've heard a lot of great summaries throughout the afternoon, summarizing some of the amazing science that has gone into our knowledge to date and helping to identify some of these key threats and factors affecting the persistence and recovery of the southern residents. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you see as the existing data gaps? What do we need to know to help implement some of the mitigation and identify additional avenues, new directions?
Lynn, do you want to take that one on?
There's a lot of data that's been collected that we're still, churning through, doing analysis on. I think with the D-tags, that's one piece that we've been kind of anxiously awaiting a little bit more in-depth information on. What is it about the vessels that has the biggest impact on foraging for the whales? So the data has already been collected in that case, and it's just taking time to get through it in a stepwise process, looking at boat activity and how that affects the sound received levels, was the first step, looking at the behavior. So it takes time, but that's one I'm looking forward to getting some more results on. And then with the photogrammetry, we've seen some amazing photos today of these pictures of whales, looking at pregnancy, looking at body condition. We have annual data, we have seasonal data, but really understanding the individual variation and what are some metrics and thresholds that we can look to say, this is a healthy whale, this is a whale that has compromised reproduction, this is a whale that needs more food. We're not there yet. So in some cases, we're on the path to getting those answers from some of the studies that are ongoing, and those are two that I have in mind. I know the data's there, and more data is being collected, which is helpful to increase those sample sizes. With 76 animals, it's tough to build that statistically significant capability. So I think those are two that I have in my mind.
Sheila.
And just a couple of points from the Canadian side. I think one of our greatest deficiencies is we have these regulations. We have the Fisheries Act, we have the Species at Risk Act that say you cannot kill, harm, harass, or you cannot disturb, but we don't have thresholds or definitions of what those actually are. So how do we enforce the harm or harassment without actually knowing what those are? So in some ways, those protections are moot until we come to some very clear decisions so that our enforcement personnel can address those issues. And well, I'll just leave it at that because we're over time.
I'd just like to also add to that is from the social science perspective, there's some big holes in knowing what is going to drive people to change. What different choices can we encourage them to make that will benefit the whales? And how do we get that messaging to them? It's fascinating to sit in a room of biological scientists. If you sat with the social scientists, they have very different perspectives. So I think it's really important that we start to capture that and really think about the efficacy of the actions, whatever management actions. We're going to test the whale flag, and we're going to see if that works. We're going to be looking at the no-go zone and seeing what will drive people to comply. I think the other kind of key data gap is on the socioeconomic implication of losing the whales. That is huge for San Juan County. We have over 1 million visitors coming to the county every summer, and they're coming to see those whales. And so we really need to understand what we can do as a community to support their long-term survival.
I completely agree with what you just said. That's so profound and so relevant. I completely agree. On the salmon side, a couple of favorites of mine. I think the food web research the Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project is pursuing is going to be very meaningful for us and help to guide some of our management decisions. And I also would say that additional work linking habitat restoration activities to fish response will really help inform our investments of funds in each watershed, because we generally know where to do ecosystem-based recovery to target kind of systems level work within the watersheds, but to really get to, if you had choices and you could only do one project, which one would give you the biggest abundance bump or protect long-term productivity? So I think that's a place that's ripe for particularly freshwater research.
Other comments? Other questions? Not seeing any. I'd like to thank Dennis Heineman for pulling this panel together. I'd like to thank the panelists for great discussion, and thank you all for your interest and your questions. And with that, I turn it over to the chair.
Okay, thank you. So we're at the end of the day here, but just before we call it quits, let me just make sure nobody at the front table here has anything they want to, or the next table, the CCSA and staff, have anything they want to offer up from today in terms of ideas, thoughts for things we might be thinking about or taking action. So anybody here want to say something?
No, I'd just say we've gotten an incredibly great panelists and great speakers who've given us a really broad view of the issue, which is really why we came here. We hadn't been to the Pacific Northwest in 10 years, and I think they've given us a real gift in terms of understanding all of the players and all of the issues. So I guess I'd say our commitment ought to be to follow these, both to ask them to invite us back to follow the processes that are underway. That's really important, but also to keep feeding us ideas on how we can spur the efforts from the commission side.
I think that's a good point. One of the things that I probably would say I took away from the whole day is what an incredible challenge this is with competing species and solutions that aren't going to come easy. So yeah, I think we definitely need to probably come back here more frequently than every 10 years. 10 years will probably be too long, too late. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think the thing I took away from here is that there is a sense of urgency in dealing with this issue. I hadn't quite realized that. I was most touched by Ken Balcom's presentation, as were you, Mr. Chair. The last panel says, well, because of the complexity, solutions require time. I can accept that, but I don't think we're in a situation where there is a lot of time to deal with that. That's very worrisome. So.
Yeah, I think, and that's why in my mind, it sort of equates with the vaquita. At some point, people change their thoughts from investing more money and research into we really need to act, and we need to act now and quickly. The other interesting thing that struck me in the sort of last sort of comments, in part to the comments I made, is stakeholders don't like this, and and that enforcement would be difficult. But these are exactly the things that we've been pushing strongly on, again, with respect to Mexico and Mexico's actions on the vaquita. So at some level, it's disheartening that these may be exactly the same problems we face here, of stakeholders aren't happy with perhaps actions that might be important to take, and that enforcement might not work. So I just leave with that unless anybody has any other comments they want to make. Go ahead, Mike.
But even with the vaquita we also entered into that with the view that this is their problem. It's a local problem. Mexican government has to solve it. And we did everything we could to urge them in that direction in terms of research, in terms of management actions, and they responded as best they could. But this is another situation where we're hearing this is a local issue, complex, local players have to come together and make the decisions. Okay, I can accept that, but again, it's just the sense of urgency. I'm not sure I see that.
Okay, I think unless anybody else has anything they'd like to say. Francis, did you? Go ahead.
Thanks, Darryl. I'm really struck by how, actually this is very different from the vaquita situation in that there's clearly cumulative impacts. It's not the silver bullet, we keep hearing that. It's more like the silver BB, as Charles likes to say. So it's complicated. There's huge will locally on the ground. So my perspective is more sort of the opposite in that that local efforts are going to be the ones that succeed because you get buy-in from communities. So maybe, so that's one part. And the other part is this fascinating transboundary issue where we have this thriving northern resident population and we have conditions that are changing really at the southern end of a range of a continuum of animals. And I thought it was great to hear Kendra sort of talking about climate change and her movement north, and is something similar happening with the killer whales, where we should be thinking ahead of what might be happening in the future further north for them. So so stepping back from that, I think as a commission, maybe because we're a tiny little commission that is supposed to be, at an upper level, maybe we should think hard about how we can facilitate transboundary communication. Maybe that's a role that we can play because we're not local and those solutions are going to be local. But where we can possibly be more effective is, U.S. government to Canadian and work closely with our neighbors.
Francis, thank you for that because I'd like to end on a very positive note and we weren't. So.
And don't use the vaquita word.
Okay, I'll stay away from that, and I like your perspective much better than mine, so thank you. Okay, we're done for the day. Thank you.